I'm Charles Kraus, and I'm here to discuss the end of the Cold War with Stapleton Roy, Career Ambassador and Director Emeritus of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute. In the early 1990s, Ambassador Roy knew more about China and the Soviet Union than probably any of his peers in the Department of State. He had lived in China and worked across Asia, as well as in the Soviet Union as a U.S. Foreign Service officer. In 1991, he was appointed as the U.S. ambassador to Beijing, and he arrived in August of that year. Now he will reflect on the collapse of communism, the end of the Cold War, and resulting changes in the U.S.-China relationship. Now, Ambassador Roy, you arrived in China in August of 1991. This was only 2 years after the tragedy at Tiananmen Square and the bloody crackdown on student protesters. The secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang, had also been purged. Can you describe what it was like to go to China at this time? What was the sting of the Tiananmen tragedy, and how did it affect U.S.-China relations and your work on the ground in Beijing?
It was a very exciting time when I went to Beijing. During the period before I got the Beijing assignment, I had been the executive secretary of the State Department with the title of personal assistant to the Secretary of State. And essentially, I controlled the paper flow that went into the Secretary of State. During this period, we had the coming down of the Berlin Wall, and we had the gradual loosening of the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe. But at that time, it was not anticipated that the Soviet Union itself would dissolve. When I arrived in Beijing in August of 1991, it was right at the time of the August coup against Gorbachev that began the process of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And in fact, when I presented my credentials to the president of China, it was during the coup. And both of us had been watching the events in Moscow on CNN. And that was the topic of the conversation I had with him after presenting my credentials. The breakup of the Soviet Union was a very significant development. It had a domestic impact in China, and it had an international impact. Domestically, there had been a sort of glamour about the U.S.-China relationship, because even though China and the United States achieved the breakthrough that led to the establishment of diplomatic relations, during the final stages of the Cultural Revolution, when conditions in China were terrible. But everybody recognized that this was a breakthrough of enormous significance, and in fact it was the turning point in the Cold War. Psychologically, after 1972, when President Nixon went to China, the United States became self-confident that the trend of history was on our side, even though we didn't expect there to be a breaking up of the Soviet Empire. But when the events in June of 1989 occurred, it essentially destroyed the image of China in the United States. And Ambassador Lilly, who was our ambassador in China at that time, had a very difficult time because one of the dissidents had received asylum in the U.S. Embassy. Attitudes were very hostile toward our embassy in Beijing. And as a result, Ambassador Lilly's assignment ended after 2 years, and I was sent in as his replacement. This was still in the post-Tiananmen period. Attitudes in the United States were hostile toward China. The issue of China was being used by the Democrats in Congress to attack a president whose big strength was foreign policy. And since on most issues they had no ability to criticize his handling of things, they seized on the China issue, which of course was a particular interest of his because of his earlier assignment as the head of the liaison office in Beijing, to go against him. So I arrived in China under these circumstances, and the first thing that occurs after I arrived there is the beginning of the process of the unraveling of the Soviet Union. So this had two important consequences. One was domestically in China. The events in June of 1989 had undermined the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And some people watching what was taking place in Beijing in 1989 thought that communist rule in China might be coming to an end. In fact, that was not the case. And China was able to restore stability in China. So when I arrived in China, the legacy of Tiananmen was no longer an active event in China. But the international impact of the events in Tiananmen were still very alive. And as the Soviet Empire began to unravel with the loosening of Soviet control over the Eastern European satellite states, and then the gradual declarations of independence by the individual republics of the Soviet Union, it looked as though communist rule was collapsing globally. And that meant many people wondered whether this was going to have an impact on China. The Chinese leaders were very conscious of this. So this was a very delicate time in China, because not only was the communist world losing the position that it had occupied ever since World War II, but China itself was in the spotlight as to what might happen. So one of my early challenges in China was to convince Washington that it should not base policy toward China on the assumption that communist rule in China was about to collapse. Because in fact, our understanding of the situation in China at that time was that stability had been restored and that the ruling group in China was not under any immediate challenge that might threaten its continued rule. The second impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union was it removed the Soviet threat. I think we all know that the breakthrough to China occurred in 1971 and 72 because the United States and China were both so concerned by the Soviet threat that they decided that cooperation between them was worth doing, even though we had had a hostile relationship up to that point. And from 72 until we established diplomatic relations in 1979, and then for the decade after that, we had been busily trying to expand our relationship with China based on our common sense that the Soviet threat still was a potential danger to our national interests. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of a sudden that rationale was removed. And this occurred at a time when the image of China had turned hostile in the United States. So that meant, with a new administration coming in Washington, the strategic underpinning for the U.S.-China relationship had been removed. And as you recall, the Clinton administration began with the sense that the primary focus of our relationship with China would be human rights. And early in my assignment there, the president made the decision to attach human rights criteria to the U.S. decision as to whether or not we would renew most favored nation trading privileges for China. So not only did I have a hostile public opinion in the United States that affected the relationship, but I also had an administration that no longer had a clear sense of what the strategic basis for dealing with China should be. So there was a significant impact on the U.S.-China relationship from both of these developments.
You had mentioned that as you were presenting your credentials, you watched on TV with your Chinese counterparts news about what was happening in the Soviet Union. How else did you keep appraised of what China and Chinese leaders were thinking about what was going on in the Soviet Union? Was this a frequent topic of conversation you had with Chinese counterparts, or were you mostly reading the tea leaves in the media, in the Chinese media?
Embassies do both. Our embassy was still relatively small, but it was very, very competent. And naturally, we had contacts throughout the Chinese government. We had contacts throughout the diplomatic community. There was a Soviet embassy in Beijing, at the time, and the U.S. Embassy was in touch with them. So we could not only go out and talk to Chinese to get their impressions of what was going on, but we also could talk to our diplomatic colleagues, some of whom were Eastern Europeans or neighbors of the Soviet Union. Some of them were the Soviets themselves. And we had contacts with all of those people. Plus, we had access to the international news media. And we had the experience that many of the officers had already developed over the decades before that.
And based on what you had previously said, I mean, you had sensed that stability would prevail in China, even as communism was collapsing in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, many people held different views. Many people thought the same thing could happen in China. I mean, what was sort of the source of your view that China would endure and continue to be led by the Chinese Communist Party even after 1991?
The principal change was on the part of the Chinese themselves. What made the 1989 events so difficult for the Chinese Communist Party to deal with was that there was considerable sympathy for the desire of the student demonstrators in Tiananmen for an opening up of the political system. And if you recall, the demonstrations occurred because of the death of Hu Yaobang, who had been the liberal-minded general secretary of the Communist Party during the early 1980s. He was removed in 1986 by Deng Xiaoping because the reform and openness process had resulted in some instability in student populations around China, and Deng Xiaoping felt that Hu Yaobang had not been handling that with sufficient rigor to maintaining stability. So he was replaced by Zhao Ziyang, who up to that point had been the premier, and Li Peng at that point became the premier. So in the lead up to Tiananmen, we had this ferment taking place in China. And in the middle of the decade, China carried out a price reform which completely transformed the economic system in China. Up to that point, the desirable goods in China were all in scarce supply. And I remember when I arrived in China in 1978 and 79, we had to bring with us all of the everyday necessities that you would expect to use in a post. And when I went back to China 10 years later, all of those commodities were available freely in China. So the price reform had had a dramatic impact on what was produced in China. But at the same time, it had resulted in enormous increases in the prices of everyday commodities. And the result was, it wasn't simply the political ferment that was made possible by the opening up of the domestic environment in China, but there were also these economic difficulties that people had to cope with because of the changes in price structures that affected their everyday lives. So it was the combination of these things that came together, and what it did was it produced a split in the Communist Party leadership over how this should be managed, with some people, such as the General Secretary, Zhao Ziyang, believing that China should accommodate this process, and others believing that it had already gone too far and there should be a crackdown. And it was the events in the lead up to the Tiananmen events of June 1989 when this split became acute. And this led to the removal of Zhao Ziyang as the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party. So this was a period of great ferment in China. While the students were in the square, many people in the bureaucracy of China were actually sympathetic to what the students were doing. But when I returned to China in 1991, I found that sympathy had changed. The conclusion of the people who had been most sympathetic to the student demonstrations was that it had gone too far, it had set back the reform process in China, and that the government was justified in cracking down in order to maintain stability. Because there is a general feeling in China based on its modern history during the 20th century that stability is the biggest threat to China, instability. And so therefore anything that threatens stability tends to cause people to support efforts to intervene in order to maintain stability. And that was the prevailing mood when I came back. So I had been in China in 1989 on visits, and when I went back in 1991, I found the mood had changed very significantly. Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you believe the United States got its China policy wrong, in the sense that the administration failed to come up with an overarching priority for the relationship that could replace the former Soviet threat. What would you say the United States got right in its China policy in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, we have to differentiate here. I wouldn't go so. I think the technical aspects, I thought it was a mistake at the time, but I did my very best to carry out the president's decision to achieve improvement in various areas of human rights. And in fact, I found that the Chinese were willing to work with us on that question. But this was during the Clinton administration. In the Bush administration, the real problem for the president was trying to salvage the relationship because of the damage caused by the television coverage of the bloody crackdown in Beijing in June of 1989. The Clinton administration came in with an ideological view of China as opposed to a carefully considered objective view of what the circumstances were in China. If you recall, during the presidential election campaign in 1992, candidate Governor Clinton compared Beijing to Baghdad. Well, in fact, the comparison between Beijing and Baghdad was not an accurate one. Beijing was very, very different. Beijing was carrying out even though the reform process had been set back, but before the president took office, you had the 14th Party Congress in China in the fall of 1992, and it had pushed the Tiananmen freezing of the reform process in China behind it and had strongly reaffirmed the reform and openness policies that Deng had initiated at the beginning of the 1980s. And so the Clinton administration came into office critical of China for its crackdown on Tiananmen at a time when China was putting Tiananmen behind it and moving rapidly toward economic development. The American business community spotted this trend immediately. Washington was not interested in that trend. Washington still saw China as a pariah state with a bad domestic human rights situation, and it wanted to use the economic leverage that we had through our trade relationship in order to force China to bring about significant improvements in various human rights areas within 1 year. That was an unrealistic goal, but my judgment as ambassador was it would be possible to make progress in all of the areas. But how significant that progress would be remained to be seen. My problem was there was a dispute in Washington between those who, having put the linkage between human rights and most favored nation treatment for China in place, they didn't want to remove them. So in their view, no matter what China did, they wanted to keep those linkages in place. Whereas other people in the administration recognized that China's economy was growing rapidly again, and we ought to be trying to expand our trade relationship with China. So there was a dispute in Washington, which made it impossible for me as American ambassador to get guidance from Washington that I could use in working with China on trying to get the human rights improvements. Because if you want somebody to do something, you have to be able to tell them what you will do if they are prepared to do what you are asking them to do. And Washington was frozen up on that process. So this was a very difficult time in managing the U.S.-China relationship. But the general intent of the Clinton administration was to improve our relations with China. And after the president made the determination in May of 1994 to break the linkage that we had put on in 1993, we actually began to resume visits to China at the cabinet secretary level. Our Secretary of Defense came, our Secretary of Commerce came, our Secretary of Labor came, and finally our relationship began to be slowly moving back toward a more normal situation.
What do you think the key lesson that China drew from the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was? If they drew one big, broad lesson from this experience, what was it for China?
They did a thorough assessment of what it was that caused the Soviet regime to collapse so suddenly in the Soviet Union, because China had no more anticipated this than other outside observers. And their conclusion was that the villain was Gorbachev. They felt that he had opened up the system much too rapidly without delivering any economic benefits. In other words, they saw his reformasi and glasnost policies as increasing instability factors in the Soviet Union without delivering the benefits that could shore up the wisdom of the changes that were taking place. So in their mind, Gorbachev became the symbol of what China itself wanted to avoid. So while they were rapidly implementing very far-reaching market reforms in China's handling of its economy, they kept a very tight grip on the political system in order to avoid making what, in their view, was the mistake that Gorbachev had made.
Ambassador Roy, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on the end of the Cold War and the changes in the U.S.-China relationship. It's been a real pleasure.
Not at all.
Thank you.
Thank you.